Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Christensen. Welcome to the One Sage's View podcast. I am excited to be back, and I have a wonderful guest this time. But before I dive into that, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this podcast or share this podcast with anyone you think it might appreciate the content or might support them. So thank you very much. As you know, I'm so grateful to share my passion of astrology with you and how it can better our lives. So let's just dive right in. So I want to introduce my guest today. I have had a couple of times in my history of astrology that I've connected with Amanda, but I want to introduce Amanda Moreno. She has been a practicing astrologer, soul worker, coach, and mentor for more than a decade, with an emphasis on evolutionary psychology or psychological, and experiential astrology. She is certified in deep memory process as a practitioner and a supervisor, and she combines psychosynthesis, integrative somatic parts work, and other forms of practical woo in her client sessions. Amanda's greatest joy is helping folks connect with her spark of genius, and she can be found at her website at www.aquarianspirals.com. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you on the podcast because I went to Norwalk in May, and you were a speaker at Norwalk, and I loved your topic. I remember highlighting it in the details of, like the lineup of speakers, because this is really, I think, for a lot of people that, especially in maybe the evolutionary, who are drawn towards evolutionary astrology because of, the focus on, not only on ourselves, but where it comes from in our history. And that's what really drew me to your talk. And so we're going to be expanding on that a little bit. So I want to get into, just what this theme is. It's Moon-Uranus, ancestral healing, but there's so much more in there and kind of start going in that direction. So there's a content warning I think is important. I want you to share what that is because we might get into some information on this podcast that may need that.
Yeah, and so I don't anticipate deep diving into the details of traumatic stories, but I think it's always worth mentioning just to give folks a heads up that when we're talking about things like ancestral healing, we're talking about ancestral trauma as well, right? And so even when we're talking about where terms like intergenerational trauma come from, they are rooted in things like mass genocide and the Holocaust. And trauma also often corresponds with themes of addiction or suicide. And so just a heads up that, the subject matter could get heavy at times. And then we're always geared towards looking at, the healing components of it as well.
So thank you for that, because I know that there was a very specific slide on that during your lecture. So, okay. So diving into kind of what, I think a lot of people may need to understand what ancestral trauma, like a definition, so they have that kind of at the beginning of this to understand that. And why might that be significant to an individual as they're seeking answers or, finding ways to heal and just looking for those breakthroughs and identifying even their deep patterns. I mean, what is ancestral trauma?
Yeah. And so, it just kind of going back to one of the first things you said, the Norwalk lecture that I gave, it was so heartening to me afterwards because so many people were coming up talking about how learning about their ancestral trauma has become an increasing part of not just their spiritual practice or their psychological practice, but their astrological practice as well. And like you said, with evolutionary astrology in particular, we're already thinking about these bigger swaths of time and understanding these patterns. And so I think that, in the collective conversation right now, we have much more understanding about the fact that what happened to the people that came before us has impact on us, and that can be in lots of different ways. And so when we're talking about trauma, essentially, if I can essentialize such a huge topic, we're talking about, energy getting stuck when something significant happens. So a traumatic response is a physiological response to an event that occurs, and it creates these kind of physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual stuck points or wounds within us that then impact our lives. And it's not just at the emotional and mental level, it's often at the physiological level as well. And so we're talking about ancestral trauma or intergenerational trauma. We're talking about trauma that carries over time. And so it's not necessarily like, the same thing happening to subsequent generations, although that can be it, because we know that things like abuse and addiction tend to, reimprint or perpetuate throughout generations. But it can also be something like, a person who lives through the Holocaust and has their own emotional and spiritual repercussions that are based in that. But what we're learning through the field of epigenetics is that trauma also creates changes to our genes. And so changes to the ways that we respond that are then passed down physiologically through generations. And so it has that behavioral component, right? Like if a parent is really abusive because of trauma that they incurred, then like one child might shut down, one child might act out, but there is the physiological reality as well, or the genetic level.
I think that's interesting. Like one child may go one way with it and another. I come from a big family. I just want to bring it a little personal. And my grandma and a lot of grandparents, I guess, depends on how old you are when you're listening to it. Like my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived through the war, right? Like she was a woman during but also prior to that, they had the Great Depression. So she had, a lot of experience around that and not having things and what is needed in the essentials. And so that was transferred from my grandmother as she became a mother to my mother, and some certain qualities and behaviors. And then that transferred even into my siblings, right? So you can see it. Right. And that's a lesser degree kind of thing, but it was pretty significant, I think, for a collective group of souls. Right.
Yeah. And it's a good example, right? Because there is those like inherited traits, inherited behaviors. And one of the things I've noticed, I've been practicing evolutionary astrology since before astrology had this kind of like big renaissance, right? And so I have clients coming in who are really interested in this idea, but they kind of, glitch out with the more spiritual language that's used, like karma and reincarnation. And so then I'm like, okay, we can think about this lots of different ways. We can think about this as, behaviors that perpetuate through families. We can think about this as hereditary conditions or chronic conditions or intergenerational trauma. And so it really expands evolutionary astrology as well.
Right. And I mean, then that's just one kind of image, of experience that transferred down, and that shows up in a myriad of ways. And there's other layers of other kind of traumatic experiences that are in my family, and I think other people have them too. So maybe by talking about it helps people kind of recognize that. And I kind of moved through a spiritual, maybe even just like my trauma was breaking through at a particular moment after my daughter was born. So then when I got in deeper into evolutionary astrology, I was like, my daughter was born before I had my kind of awakening and started more deep healing work. So it kind of made me wonder, like, what did my daughter pick up that I hadn't healed that is definitely in my sphere? You know what I mean? Yeah. And sure enough, as she got older, I was like, oh, there it is. Like you could see parts of it, right? Like it's like a fractal and being reflected back to you. It's like, and yet she has her own soul experience that she's trying to untie something for herself, and work through something that's her own. And this just ties into the story. I've been like wrestling with this one a little bit because, it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't have my healing. The majority of my healing came after that. Right. But she, by observation, was like observing like me as a mother, like what I would do. And after I continued my healing, like things that I would pick up and I would, share that with her as she got older. I mean, certain things it's appropriate for how old she is, right? So I kind of think that's interesting as a parent, and then just the ancestral line, like on this conversation, because it shows up in her. I know this is my daughter's chart, but she has Moon square Uranus, and I thought, wow, that's so powerful. When I saw your talk, I was like, oh wow, that's landing right there.
Yeah, and so I'm sure that we'll kind of get into the, the aspects and phasal relationships of it all, but I'm also just thinking about, how amazing it is that, you have awareness around these things and can
Yeah.
therefore like see them and work with them. But also like one of the things I love is that we can have the spiritual dimension, right? Like,
Right.
okay, what is her soul working with in yours, but also with epigenetics, right? So like the
Right.
physiological
I'm thinking of
characteristics.
the actual physical being part of myself,
Yeah.
my
And
DNA,
so
my what's resonating in that physical sense, because you have your eggs and then you get pregnant. You know what I mean? You have that comes through the line, like grandmother who was pregnant with mother. There's a little, I don't know, a little image on this of your, when your mom's mom was pregnant, the eggs were already in her. You know what I mean? It's kind of like carries
yeah.
so
And
deeply down.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so like I said this in my lecture, like I don't have a scientific mind. I don't hold those concepts as well. But one of the cool things about epigenetics is that it's not changes to the DNA, it's changes to the genetics, which are reversible, right? So those
Mm-hmm.
things that
Mm-hmm.
happen, those genetic changes because of trauma are reversible.
Right.
They can
Right.
change. And so that's also this kind of like it's a very promising and interesting frontier when it comes to the science of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like on, all the fronts. It's not, because of the science fascinates me, but I don't understand that deeply either. It's like I'm an astrologer first, or a mom first, then astrologer, and then you mix it all together and you get this like, I'm curious about this. But it requires, deep diving into like understand. It's like I think to actually even have the scientific mind to answer some of those questions, like I have no idea why that works or whatnot, but it's kind of like it points you in that direction. It's like, well, if you want to go deeper here, you can. But I'm on the same page with you in terms of the quality that we understand that we can change. We have that in our awareness, and that healing is a part of the equation. I think every soul is healing something. That's just me, but I think it kind of it's just an interesting perspective when you think about the family line on either side, right? Your mother's side or your father's side, and then and then if you bear children, what that looks like, or going from there. So yeah, this is not just Moon square Uranus. It's just Moon and Uranus in some kind of relationship to some of this. Is the kind of what the theme is about, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we're focusing on like one segment of understanding ancestry using astrology. There's lots of different ways to do that. This is by far not the only way, right? You can look at the 4th house, the 8th house, the 12th house. Those are kind of more traditionally known as the houses of karmic inheritance and ancestry and like roots and home and things like that. And so what I've discovered just over time is focused on when the moon and Uranus are in hard aspect to each other in a chart. And so, I mean, full disclaimer, I have Moon Uranus conjunct in my chart. And so it's been a big theme for me. And I think that a lot of times we tend to like attract clients who have similar things that they're working out. And so, what I've discovered is that a lot of times when there is the moon and Uranus involved in those hard aspects in the chart, there's some kind of like focus on breaking free from breaking down ancestral patterns, familial relationships. And that can be like a really empowering thing, but sometimes it's a really difficult thing. It's almost as if,
daunting.
the person's being confronted with these really entrenched patterns within this family system. Or, it's not even just folks who were born to their, who were raised with their family of origin. We see this or I have seen this with folks who, were adopted, folks who have no relationship with their family of origin whatsoever.
Right.
And so it's just been one of those themes that's fascinated me for years.
Yeah, but they still have some kind of aspect with Uranus, because even adopted or whatnot, the archetypal pattern is there. And so the parents that they end up with still have that pattern. It's in the mix somehow, somewhere that they're working out, or that person is working out,
Yeah, totally. And I guess I feel like maybe I'm getting away with myself right here. Maybe it's helpful to just kind of like break down Moon and Uranus a little bit, so we have that kind of like
Okay.
foundation for this. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, the moon is more of a personal planet than Uranus, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about the moon, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways it's the most earthy symbol that we have, right? The astronomical moon is literally tied to the earth, and it has impacts, measurable, visible impacts on Earth. And
Mm-hmm.
so moon has a lot to do with our bodies in the chart,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically the ways that our bodies hold our emotions, like our bodies hold the waters. And so it has to do as well, I think we talk about this a lot in evolutionary astrology, with our ego identities. So ego identity is kind of like this two-part thing. I think of it as like moon as being our initial associations of identity, like who I am based on like who I'm the child of, who I'm the sibling to. It's those like familial resonances.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sun is more like our ego expression. So how I actualize and express that ego identity. And so the moon is this very personal experience of like how we've interacted with our environment and the emotional impact that's had and the somatic impact that's had.
Mm-hmm.
And somatic is really this like term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's this really multidimensional thing, right? Our somatic experience is about the ways that our feelings, our sensations, our emotions, our thoughts all interact within us. And so again, moon is just kind of like holding all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But then moon also, like through all of those dynamics, taps into our ancestry. It is how we were sculpted in the womb. It's how we are sculpted by the things that happened to our parents, or to whoever was caregiving us. So when that starts to interface with Uranus, we see one of the like core keywords of Uranus, right? Change.
Mm-hmm.
Coming into play. And so with Uranus, we could go on for hours about it, but some of the relevant things are that Uranus has to do with a person's like long-term unconscious memories. And it's also a force for liberation. And so liberation is one of those terms that we can be like, yes, I'm fighting for liberation, but also sometimes when we get freed from things, our ego identity, our lunar principle is like, what do I do with this? Who am I now?
Mm-hmm.
And so Uranus is also associated with the principle of individuation, which is, this term that comes out of Jungian psychology that has to do with, in essence, like the process of becoming who you're meant to be, which again can be this really empowering, liberating thing. But within that process of becoming who you're meant to be, it's oftentimes very isolating or alienating because you are breaking down the social constructs that you're embedded in, or you're breaking down the familial constructs that you're embedded in, which is often the case with Moon Uranus and hard aspect. And so there are fears around aloneness or experiences of being or feeling exiled or feeling like a black sheep in the family.
Yeah.
But then you can also just think of it as like quite literally that like tender lunar body receiving these like jolts constantly from Uranus that can feel kind of ouchy.
Yeah.
To put it eloquently.
Yeah. And so that's great. That kind of summary to kind of capture all that for everyone listening who's not had the privilege of your earlier talk or knowing some of your other work. I mean, I think that's really important to have that too. So when you talk about the phasal, maybe of the phase of the relationship, do you have any like insights on that? Because like my daughter has the square, or you might have Uranus square to the fourth house, or cardinal or something like that. But also, so different phases of what that might look like. I think there's something to be realized there, like on the, what that soul is healing. The phase may give you some pinpoints of the timing of it. You know what I mean? Like what this, what your incarnation may be working on at this kind of little slice of that pie in time, right? That healing journey, because some of these things take more than one life. So
yeah, and I mean that also brings up a good point that like, while I'm talking about Uranus moon in the natal chart, this is also relevant for folks who are receiving transits of Uranus in hard aspect to their moon, right? A lot of these themes can come up during those times, or like adjustments to their connection with their family line during those times. And so, I'm kind of talking about like aspects here, which is connected to phasal relationships, right? That just adds more nuance. And I don't know that we have the time to go into the details of that.
Okay, fair enough.
But To just kind of go over, the most simplistic version of it, the phases give a lot more nuance to what we're talking about. So for example, like Uranus in a new phase conjunction to the moon, I should say the moon in a new phase conjunction to Uranus, right? So the moon is just starting to separate out from Uranus.
Separate from, yeah.
Yeah, it still has a little bit more of a liminal quality. And so there can be a feeling of like, I don't belong here. Who are these people? Like, did I really, is this my family? But it's a little bit more passive, right? So it's just a feeling of like, almost, that Uranian shock, but not a lot of like conscious thought or awareness behind it. And of course, like different parts of the chart give more complexity and all of that. But by the time we get to the first quarter square, so the moon separating up to about 90 degrees from Uranus, all squares carry that energy of like conflict and adjustment. And so one way to think about this is like, these people are more actively engaging in creating a new myth. So more actively engaging in looking at the family system and being like, I don't know about that. Right? And it might not come through in that way, but the point is that there's usually more like active conflict going on. The person like fighting against the system, often still in relationship with the family members. Okay. It's not so much of like an active exit from the family line. It's like, wait, that doesn't work. Let's talk about it. Or, there's identity conflicts or lack of acceptance.
Okay, that's
and
good.
So it's still working on like, if things were like linear and straightforward, which they're not, but it's still working on like healing things in the family system through conflict with the members of the family or with the narratives of the family line.
Okay. And that's the first square, the opening square.
The opening square, yeah.
The crisis, the first crisis kind of yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a good one. I like that description.
Yeah. So then the opposition, right? The moon and Uranus within about 180 degrees of each other is still more on that relational side of things. And so there can be those confrontations, but it's not as like butting heads. It's more just like feeling into the polarity of things. And oftentimes there is still that need for like relationality within it. I love you. I'm invested in this relationship and this isn't working.
Right. Like I need to separate myself from this to a degree so I can have my individual self be
so
separate.
I've noticed,
right. Yeah. I think that to me, that opposition very much feels like, there might be points in your life where you'll see that activated and what's on deck to give it to yourself. How do you love yourself in the mix of all that? Right. Because you're getting the lightning bolt from the opposition.
Totally. And I've noticed, inherent within oppositions is oftentimes polarization. And I've noticed when I'm working with folks in depth and they have Uranus opposite the moon, it's usually either like they're saying like, let's get into family therapy. Like let's work it out in that relational container. Or what they're doing is actively polarizing. And so, to give a, oversimplified example, it would be like the family system is fundamentalist Christian. And so this person's like, I'm going to be like nihilistically atheist.
Right. So they take
so they're figuring out the
polarity point.
They're doing the opposite thing.
Right. And it doesn't make them wrong or the other side wrong. It's just where they are in their presentation of that. Yeah, right. But it's the perfect scenario if the soul is trying to navigate that would be what's real, right? Like you have to like really understand what you believe to like take your position. And this is going to be the counterpoint. And it's just, to me, that's kind of like how, if there's an author of the life, how uniquely good that would be for that person to really say, no, this is where I am right now. And so it's always measured against that. So I think
it can have that Uranian quality of like rebelliousness, right? Like, well, y'all are doing this, so I'm going to do that. But it can also just be like the person stumbling into something that's the
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's then good. With the last quarter square, we kind of enter the energies that are more, a lot of the time, more about like separation from the family system. And so, whereas the first aspects we've been talking about are more about that kind of like active confrontation and relationality. These are more about the last quarter square, the balsamic conjunction, are more about the releasing and the letting go. They can feel heavier in some ways. I mean, one way of thinking about it is maybe that like you've been doing this thing with this family system for a long time and you're like, okay,
So good. Yeah.
this is happening again, right? But there's still with the last quarter square, there's that emphasis on adjustment, which can lead to letting go, loosening of the bonds, loosening of the relationships. Maybe not everyone in the family.
Right. It just depends, like who, yeah, because you could have multiple people in a family, right? And so it might be a few members that you're like, yeah, you go.
Yeah, and
No.
and you know, I've kind of said this, but I think it's also important to remember that it's not necessarily like the literal members of the family. It can be the family narratives. It can be the family mythology.
Yeah, it's the beliefs
Right?
or
So
something
like
that's been
I
held.
keep
Yeah.
coming across this family mythology that says that like we always lose the ones we love.
Oh, yeah.
And
Those
I'm
belief
engaging with
systems.
that. Yeah.
Right.
So then kind of similar with the balsamic conjunction, similar to the new phase conjunction. So balsamic conjunction is when the moon is kind of closing back in on Uranus. There's a feeling of like, who are these people? But it's more of this like, I don't belong here, right? So the sense of identity is more thoroughly developed and a feeling of exhaustion. So again, there's that release, like I can't muster the energy to do this thing. And so there, you know, sometimes it's more active or conscious exit from the family. And, you know, again, it's just all going to depend on a person's context, but it has that feeling of kind of like wrapping something up.
Sure. This just made me, something just dropped in while you were talking about these phases that I think is super valuable. It's something I've done in my astrology for my own healing, because I got into astrology for my own healing first, and then people found out what I was doing. It's like, hey, can you share, please? I tend to like go back on just like this was what I was born. This is the phase of my particular aspect, whatever, right? But then I'll cross over the life experience. Like, when was it square? When was it opposite? When was it the third quarter waning back to what it was when I was born, right? So this will go in through the spiral because Uranus is what, an 84-year cycle around. So I think there's some kind of values like seeing those themes pulled out over the timeline of life, like taking your own life or taking someone that that is older, and then you can kind of see it. If you have your grandparents' birth time, that's awesome. That's a great example to kind of dive into some storylines if you have enough information, because I think that's like, oh, that's how they were working that out, or is that's how it was showing up, and then you can be more informed about like then translating it over yourself, like, okay, I'm only this far into my life, and maybe I'm in my 50s, maybe I'm in my 40s or my 30s, you know what I'm saying? And so you're kind of stretching that out and kind of looking at it from being the observer into it a little bit, and it helps kind of look at it like that. So it kind of made me think of that when you were talking about the phases. Not only we're born with a phase, but there'll be this spiral of life, and then kind of how does that play? Who are the players? What's the themes? And that's how I get into it. Just as what I might take to someone I need to talk further about, like a counselor or a therapist or something, or I'm healing this and this is what I want to be focusing on. I can see it, but how do I make the change? You're like, how do I do the shift? Yeah.
That's one of the many blessings of astrology, is that kind of like, it helps us to see the cycles. It helps us to see the patterns over time, whether it's, before or after. And it's also what you're saying is also making me think of one direction I didn't talk about in the lecture, but I think about a lot, which is seeing repeating patterns in family chart. Like, for example, I was somehow lucky enough to come across birth times for my great grandmother and my great great grandmother and my grandmother.
Wow, that's awesome. You have that.
Yeah, my mom, great grandmother, great great, and my grandmother all have Moon Pluto conjunctions.
Powerful.
And so I don't have that, but I have Moon in Scorpio. Right? So modern rulership ruled by Pluto, but still that kind of theme of transformation. And so, that just, you'll see things like that in family systems where there's signatures.
Right. And you have like a little aha moment about it. It's like, oh, okay, I'm a little fractal of that. Yeah. Like, I don't have my mother's, I would love to have my mother's mother. I have my father's mother's birth times, but I haven't found them yet. But I've got my mom, me, and my daughter. So I have like a 3, but there's also other people in my family where there's 4 generations that we do have the time. So it's like my mother, sibling, their children, and then their children. So I can kind of see it like that. I get the privilege of seeing it like that. So yeah. And you can see some of those signatures play out.
And you figure out like how to relate to it. Like for me, I'm like, okay, what's the placement? Why don't I have like Pluto moon, and I'm like, okay, well, I have moon squaring the nodes, right? There's something unresolved from the family line that
Yeah.
I'm
And you're
working through in this
appointed
lifetime.
coming out in the physical of
Yeah.
that embodiment, right? So one of the questions I had kind of preset for us, like maybe ties into this, is like, how does someone realize significant progress on soul healing in the closing square or balsamic? And the reason I ask this is because just the process of truly healing and having a breakthrough, like I imagine people can have levels of healing no matter what phase they're in. That makes sense to me. But it's like, how, I don't know, I haven't landed on this like exactly like yet. It's just kind of like this curious thought that's sitting there for me. That's why I asked the question. Maybe I come to something in our conversation and open dialogue, is when you're born with something and then you're going through and then you explore it, like I was saying. And then you're like, okay, I am actively doing something to heal that through different inner work, astrology, somatic healing, physical, maybe body trauma, all the things that we can kind of line up and like, okay, this is this is on my slate for what I'm going to be doing for the next decade or whatever, right? And you move through that. But is there anything that really helps us? Is it just the reflective nature? Because I'm a big journaling person. I encourage people to journal. Is that the only place that we can really, that's not the only place that we can really see it. It's kind of a little bit more than that. It's like how we actually step into completely other spheres of experience, I think.
Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, what a big question.
I know, right? That just kind of landed. There you go. It's a big one.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I mean, I will riff on this a bit for sure, but as you're saying those things, what I'm thinking about is like just the necessity for like grace and compassion, because I think sometimes we can get really wrapped up in that, like, but how do I do this? How do I make sure that I fix this or like heal this thing, right? And I don't, it's not to be cliche, but healing's not linear, right? And so then we just like use our tools, but sometimes this stuff is exhausting. Sometimes it's very tiring. And so I think that just like having, giving yourself grace, having compassion for yourself. But another reason it's difficult to talk about is because everything's so different. And so, what I'm thinking of is, one of the examples that I gave in that lecture, which has a person who has moon in last quarter square with Uranus. And it was such a beautiful story in so many ways because, the family mythology that she came in with was they always leave. There was a family pattern of
that was a good example. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a family pattern of, the women going back several years, being left by their spouses for younger women. And not just that, but like it setting them into significant long-term mental health issues up to and including, attempted suicide. And so it was something that was so present for this client of mine that it's not what she came in to work on.
Right. But what shows up to be dealt with, right? So
yeah. But over the course of working together, she really, so it's a Leo moon squaring Uranus in Scorpio, and she starts engaging in a lot of ways, but a lot of it is through art because she miraculously happened to find some old art that was created by her grandmother. And she
that
was
touched
so
her.
called
Yeah.
to it. Yeah. And that in that process of starting to let herself paint, she also started asking her mother questions about the family line and about how things played out. And so she was getting this kind of like visceral contact with not just like the stories, but this process of, artistic catharsis and bringing it through that was taking a lot of the energy off of this need that she had to like make sure that her partner didn't leave, and so there was this kind of process of freedom coming through that artistic catharsis that was very visible in just the way that she physically presented herself, right? She started off just like wearing black to every consultation, and then by the end she was wearing color. And
so you're seeing the shift just in just these subtle things. Yeah.
And I guess, relevant to what you're saying about how to heal it, one of the things that came through is, she was feeling better in her relationship, but she still didn't have control over whether or not her partner left. But what she was developing was the understanding that she would be okay if
and that's the major shift, right? Like, because if before there was a before, like that's why she's the grandmother and the mother and the line of that thinking, the belief system, but it's the belief that changes up.
Yeah, the
Not that
beliefs, the behaviors, you know, that, and this isn't true for all ancestral trauma, but I think a lot of times what I notice in this work is that the patterns don't go away as much as the charge changes, our ability to like deal with
Yeah,
that
the stinger is
changes.
not as
Yes.
stingy.
Or it is, but then we
Right.
have a different set of skills to deal with it with.
Right.
And sometimes I say to my clients, like, you know what, even if like the thing happens and then you feel yourself going back into the old patterns, I think that sometimes just the act of being like, yes, this is what I'm doing now changes it, instead of just being like whipped into the whirlwind of it.
Yes. That's good. Yeah, this is what I'm doing with it now. Yeah, that's so good.
And so then I guess just by way of example for the, you know, balsamic conjunction, you know, because these two, the last quarter square, the balsamic, do have this feeling of like an ending that's happening. And so the other one was, you know, I had a balsamic conjunction client who, long story short, was part of a long line of people, of family members who had fought in all the wars. This was a older man. He came to me in his 70s, but he hadn't fought in a war. Like, he had gotten out of fighting and it had changed the whole family dynamic. He had experienced a lot of guilt and guilting because of it. And what happened in the process of our working together, it wasn't through work that we did, it was just like the timing of it. He remembered, or his family had a long-term tradition of having rose gardens. And so as he was going through this process of like, what is the legacy I'm leaving? Like, my family line ends with me, quite literally. I don't have children. You know, and so he ended up planting a memorial rose garden with little like placards that told the stories of his family members and their, you know, and their honors from the wars that they had fought in,
So it's
as
in
a
the
way to
rose
kind of
garden.
honor it. But then it also ended with
Right.
that. I mean, we could say that it continues in the
It's
roses.
transformed in some way into something that's a beautiful garden. So there's that's so beautiful.
I'm getting chills thinking about it.
Yeah, that's
like, there's
gorgeous.
the releasing,
Right.
also like something new always comes.
Right. And I mean, there's another part of your talk that kind of, I guess it rung my bell, so it resonated. I'm sure everyone who was listening to you that day is like, that's ringing a bell for me on something. Because the moon, sometimes the symbol of the family, which you'd mentioned before, not just individual soul, but also family as a symbolic kind of whole. You know, and that moon in square or some kind of deep aspect with the Uranus, and the theme of fracturing, not just like an event that may be a traumatic thing that gets carried through, and there's a varying levels of healing as it makes its way through, but it's also just a fracturing, and the family experience, like a holistic kind of group, and how that is in effect, or the negative influences on that in, say, a moon in Taurus like myself, and like that security frame. And then there's also the disruption of bonding. That one really was strong for me when I was listening to that, because I mean, people can have these experiences where the family has this strong experience with that lightning bolt of Uranus, and in that mix, every individual have individual things, but there's something about the context of family as a group, as a whole unit, and that security place of home, security, nurturing, you know, kind of that perspective. And then the bonding piece and how that is, and you had talked about that also in your talk. That is something unique in of itself, like how you watch a family as it goes through the years, like in my own experience, maybe for other people, where you see some people take on their healing in a more serious fashion, where others may be kind of repeating things. So it's like, oh, you're doing something that's not helping you kind of move beyond that from the past, and you're stuck a little bit there. You try to, but they have to own it themselves, you know. But you can kind of see that it affects the bonding in the wholeness of it. And I don't know, does anyone that you've come into contact, maybe in your clients, or maybe even talking with other astrologers about this kind of a big subject like this around the family, like what people may do, or kind of like are observing and become aware of that, the fracturing thing? Do you know what I mean? Around the bonding part, because the bonding is something that it can have a ripple effect. Because if you have a hard time bonding, then does it pass down? Because then the next has a hard time bonding?
Yeah, so are you asking like what people do with that, or
Maybe both. Like being first, I think there's something just being aware of it. And maybe that's like this conversation can bring people aware of it. Like if a family, the moon has that hard square, hard opposition or something where the bonding was fractured early in life or childhood in some sort, and then they grow into adults, and then do they have a hard time bonding with their children, bonding in other relationships and being aware of that? I think so. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's really hard to like generalize these things.
Right.
And so, I can just kind of speak to like what is coming up for me as you're saying this. And so if we just stick with like Moon-Uranus, there is that kind of where there can be a fundamental fragmentation when it comes to a bonding experience, and that can be huge things, right? So a child that is taken away from mother, or a child that is given up for adoption, right? Again, like no judgment on any side here. We're just talking about like the traumatic aspect of it, or it could be, death of a parent, but it can also be really small, right? So I'm hearing a lot of my therapist friends talk in terms of like little t traumas. And when you
Would you call it again? Little what?
Little t traumas.
Little t traumas.
Right?
Yeah, the little
like,
earthquakes, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can have a child that is like happily eating a meal, and then like a parent like takes away the plate too early, and it has a whole impact on the full system of the child, right? And like, who are we to judge how a system internalizes things like that, And so the reason that I'm saying this is because I think that there's a lot of trauma in our society, whether it's those little t traumas or the big T ones, right? And so then we can say things like therapy or astrology, especially like a spiritually or a psychologically informed astrology, or dream work or art, or all of that can be really helpful for dealing with these things. But then also like relationality and relationships, right? Like community healing, community rituals, community and group rituals around big collective traumas, like we're living through several right now. So like, how do we put communities together? And that's such a vital part of, if we think of Uranus as being, I think of Uranus as being a co-ruler of Aquarius, right? And so it has this communal aspect to it as well.
I think of group consciousness. To me, it's the group and the consciousness within the group.
Yeah, and so since we have so many people, I think in this day and age, who feel very estranged from their families, they can't necessarily recreate that early life familial bonding, but creating it through finding communities of like-minded folks, finding communities of outsiders, finding communities of people who have gone through similar things, then helps with that relational healing capacity. But also, there's several astrologers, myself included, who are doing a lot of work with like planets as ancestors. Ari Felix has a great lecture that they've done about planets as ancestors. And so within the framework of astrology itself, interacting with planets as deities in and of themselves, developing relationships with the planets, not just as they exist within us, but like as they exist of their own accord, can be really healing, And so like, in the situations we're talking about, a person, having an altar to the moon and learning about the moon and its changeability, right? Because I'm talking about Uranus as the change bringer, but like the moon is changeable, right? Like our emotions are always changing.
It's so good. That's so true.
Yeah. So that can be really healing as well.
Yeah. And then take that metaphor beyond just the individual emotion, the emotion that sits over or is in the sphere of a family. That I think that's really, really valuable. I like that. That's really good. Wow, time is flying. It's already, we're in an hour now. So I want to kind of move along here. I just have a couple more things I want to address. One of them is, you mentioned a book in your talk that I think everybody should know about. This one I want to get as well. I can't remember the author. You're going to have to help me with the author. It's My Grandmother's Hands.
My Grandmother's Hands. Yeah. So it's by Resba Menachem. And
I'll put it in the show notes. I think I might have to go look it up because it's
because
you referenced it. Yeah.
It's very specific in some ways to
Mm-hmm.
American racialized trauma. And so the idea being that like all Americans have some level of trauma based on what's happened with race in this country since the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives really, I mean, it's a book that like you can read yourself, and there's like guided questions and all of these things to kind of just like do some self-reflecting on way
Mm-hmm.
that trauma has impacted your body, your behaviors, and things like that. And I don't know where I was going with the rest of that
No, it's
thought.
okay. But is it written in a format that's someone who's not a counselor or a therapist, they can read it?
Yeah, it's
and
not
absorb
made
it?
for counselors
Okay.
and therapists. It's made
Just
for
for
like people
everyone.
who are
Okay.
wanting to.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah.
There was also a quote that I want to talk about. There was a quote in your slides, and I want to bring it back up because it's so good, and I'll probably put it in the show notes. It's so good. It is from James Baldwin. It's like goes like this: History is not the past; it is the present. We carry out history with us. We are our history. And I think what a perfect quote for that, lecture that you shared and continue to share. We have Uranus transiting Taurus since 2018 through 2026 before it shifts over into Gemini. And most recently, the lunar nodes, they are finishing off, I guess, the true node shift out of the north node out of Taurus shifts on next week. These are right around the new moon. Wow. July 17th. So that's going to be same day. What a day that's going to be, right? So we have this shift. So we have this kind of leaving of the south node out of Scorpio and the north node from Taurus. And so I find that nodal shifting period of time, and this probably won't be released until later that week. So when you hear this, it's already happened. But yeah, the transition, like I always think of like babies being born at a particular time and what they embody and bring to the world, it just kind of helps me kind of like, what's the future? What? And I like to think about that as an astrologer. And presently with that Pluto square the nodes in its position, that's back into Capricorn, but it's still square the nodes, right? I just think it's a unique time as more souls are being born for this kind of very dynamic, rich healing, 30 years into the future from now, that this is still relevant. It's just an ongoing what we bring to the third dimension and our healing process as we embody. So I think this is a very important subject that's a continuation. It just continues in where we sort that out for ourselves and where we take it.
Yeah, and if I can just add something there, Pluto square the nodes on the cardinal axis is really highlighting the dynamic of what happens like in the home, in the private life, in the public life, what happens between,
right,
social conditioning, social constructs, and familial conditioning, familial constructs, and kind of
right,
some fundamental like reclaiming of emotional contents that need to be healed. And that's very much up always, but really right now is
really right now. I registered that when I was looking at it. I'm like, wow, it's really potent right now with that. Is there anything surprising you've learned as an astrologer about your deep dive into this astrological focus on ancestral healing that we haven't covered that I want to put out there?
Is there anything surprising? It's all surprising in that kind of way that makes you go, oh yeah, of course. Like, oh yeah, of course that's what it's like, right? But I think just the consistency of when somebody comes into my session room and they are like, I feel like a black sheep, I don't belong in my family. I'm like, oh yeah, there's Uranus and hard aspect with the moon.
Yeah.
It's surprising and yet consistent.
Right. Just kind of keeps emerging for us to like, oh, there it is. It's peeking at me again. What other favorite resources, books, lectures, webinars do you find quite useful for your clients or working with ancestral healing? We've mentioned, the grandmother's hands. Anything else?
Yeah, there is a book called, I'm just looking at my notes, Honoring Your Ancestors by Mallory Valadouas. It's a French last name. I don't know.
Okay.
But it's about ancestral veneration. And so for folks who are interested in like ancestral reconnection work, which can be done like with your biological ancestors or with cultural ancestors.
Okay.
Or with like rocks, minerals, plants, right? There are ancestors.
What's the title again? So
Honoring Your Ancestors.
Okay, cool.
And then there's a really great episode of the Astrology podcast with Aaron Vogel and Chris Brennan about intergenerational trauma in astrology that I think is really fantastic and a great resource as well.
Awesome. From an individual book that I read in the very beginnings of my astrology journey was Pluto Problems by Donna. But that's more Pluto, but it's still very good, I think, if someone's just starting to emerge into the subject material.
Yeah, and I mean, Pluto Moon is, to me, it's more about like, it's just words, but it's more about transforming the emotional contents of the family stuff, whereas Uranus has more of a theme of like breaking free, breaking away
Breaking
from,
free.
which can be more like sudden.
Yeah, it's more
right?
sudden, yes. And I guess when you're reflecting, you can see like the fractal of what we were talking about earlier, the fracture of something taking place. And so, would you say that? I can't remember. I read this book a long time ago. The book by Jeffrey Wolf Green I think he partnered with someone else on Uranus, or with just his book on Uranus. Just him. Okay. Yeah, that might be a good book. It's a little tiny one, but it's really good too. But it's been a while since I read that one. But
I know, me too. I'm like, I know the subtitle is Freedom from the Known, but I can't remember.
There you go. That's
else.
it. That's
and
it.
I'm
Yeah,
sure
it's on my bookshelf. I just haven't popped that open in a while, but I do remember in the beginning I did a lot. But yeah, in terms of just this whole subject, it's a huge, like you said, this huge swath of a subject, and but I think it's important to kind of highlight it, bring it to people's attention as they're emerging on that.
For what it's worth, when it comes to just like Uranus and trauma, Mark Jones' Healing the Soul is kind of like a go-to
classic. Very good.
For that one.
Yeah. So I'm going to have deep show notes on this one. So, and I will probably ping you on the one that you mentioned the name, but I can't remember at the top of my head for the link. So, all right. Well, I don't have any other things that I wanted to address on this. I think we've covered a lot of material, a lot of things for people to think about, kind of consider, maybe if they're doing some ancestral work, if they're doing healing, how does it tie into that? Maybe if you're looking at the moon and Uranus and whatever that aspect is and how you can pull that out and, help yourself, make new ground on healing. And I think this is a very valuable subject for that. Where can people, what's happening for you later this summer? Are you doing other things that you want to bring to people's attention right now?
Yeah. So generally speaking, I'm found at aquarianspirals.com, or my handle is aquarianspirals on the different places. I'm doing a Venus retrograde deconstructing the myth of soulmate 7-week course that's launching right around the time this will be going live.
The last week of July? Is that when that comes out? Okay, good. I'll try to have this, hopefully will be out by that Sunday, the 23rd, but sometimes video editors take a little bit more than I want.
That's fair. I will have an upcoming evolutionary astrology immersion, which will have a lot of this work in it.
Oh, awesome.
And then the lecture itself is for sale that we've been referencing. Moon-Uranus and Ancestral Healing is for sale on my website.
On your website. So I'm going to link all of those things. So that's fantastic, because those are great resources. I think you're fantastic in this work, and I think people should know about you. So thank you, everyone. This is a very, very important subject, especially for us in evolutionary astrology, but also for just souls who are healing. And this might be the very first time they hear about it, and there's just something to explore. So thank you for the time. You can find me at onesagesview.com, on my channel on YouTube. This will be on the YouTube channel, but also on Spotify, and also I'm on Instagram. So thank you very much, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your July, and look forward to the next time. Thank you. Bye-bye now.